my dad the other day, and my dad, he's always looking out for his family. My sister and I are always right there at the front of his thoughts, and we're talking about my work as a school counsellor at Aga Khan, and he says to me, I think you made a really great career choice, because we're only going to need more therapists. And I thought, yeah, you're right, Dad. People are unhappy, and people seem to be getting more unhappy. We're only going to need more therapists. Great. And actually, there is something really great in this. So it is great that people are feeling more and more comfortable with sharing their emotional lives. And it is great that the stigma around mental health has reduced to such an extent that over 80% of my students are self-referred. They're not sent to me by parents or teachers. And you might think it's a little bit sad that people are turning to a stranger for help, but actually I don't really see it like that. I see people turning to a professional for help in the way that you would turn to a plumber if your taps were broken. And that looks like a really wise choice to me. So I think, it's great how valued talking therapies are right now. And selfishly, it's great how potentially future-proofed my career is as a result. But what isn't great, and I think what my father was really speaking to, was this intuition that we are not getting happier right now, even though that's what we're all really, really striving for. And I see it in my students all the time, just happiness only, please. No anxiety, no sadness, just want to be happy. And yet we're not getting happier. And that intuition of my dad's is actually borne out by data. So you might have heard that globally, suicide rates are declining. And that's true. But suicide is still the second leading cause of death for people between the ages of 15 and 29. And although suicide globally is falling, rates of suicide are falling, depression is very much on the rise. So it's estimated that currently 300 million people are suffering with depression worldwide, and that is an 18% increase between 2005 and 2015. So I read these statistics, and I'm counselling students every day, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, what's going on? And of course, it's not just one thing, it's not just one reason why we maybe aren't getting happier, but depression is on the rise. It's likely to be lots of different factors. We can see economic inequality, we can see reduced spending on social welfare, and we can see various trends and patterns that are contributing to rising rates of depression. But it's likely to be quite different. The context of unhappiness and cause is likely to be quite different for each individual. But one of the things that I see with my students is that I think precludes them from being happy is this real striving that we have for extraordinary happiness. So we have this real longing to reach infinity and beyond, to find this happiness which never fails us, this happiness from which, we never return. But ironically, that's one of the things that stops us from being happy. Because, the more and more we're searching for this thing, the more elusive it becomes. And I see this with my students all the time. So they come in to see me and say, ma'am, I'm feeling a bit anxious, a bit sad. How can I move past this and be happy? And my job, of course, is to probe a little bit more, to say, okay, well, what's going on right now? And often the answers are really rushed. So the answer might be something like, well, yeah, I'm not living with my parents anymore for the first time. I've got loads of assignments due, all at the same time. Actually, I don't really have any friends. But those answers, like I said, they're often really, really rushed. And what the person in front of me says is, but don't worry about that, ma'am, don't worry about that. Just how can I move on and be happy? And what I see is this really violent, I can say, resistance to actually sitting with those feelings of unhappiness. There's this real resistance to sitting with that for any time at all. And the reason why that precludes us from being happy, the reason why, if you can't sit with your feelings of being unhappy, you move further away from being happy. And that's because all the time you're saying, let's just get to happiness, get to this extraordinary happiness. The whole time you're saying that, what you're really saying to yourself is, I shouldn't be feeling the way that I'm feeling. And when you're saying that to yourself, I shouldn't be feeling the way that I'm feeling, you're sort of berating yourself, you're really shaming yourself. And obviously nobody can feel happy if they've told themselves they're bad for feeling sad. It's really, really difficult. And I learnt this for myself, I would say the hard way, back in 2014. So I was about 2.5 years into my PhD at that point. I just got back from presenting at lots and lots of different conferences, and I was on this real high. I'd got loads of great feedback from colleagues, I'd made lots of connections, and then I sat down to write, and I was just totally overwhelmed with writer's block. So I had no confidence in any of my thoughts, any of my ideas, and I had absolutely no motivation to try and write, to do anything. And I really hid it from everybody around me. None of my friends or family had any idea. It was only my supervisor who knew how bad things had got, so I would be cancelling meetings with her, I'd failed to hand in my work, I started lying to her, and then eventually I started breaking down in our meetings. Just uncontrollable tears whenever we would meet. And that went on for a few months, until eventually it got to the point where she said to me, I'm not going to work with you anymore unless you get professional help. So I did. I'm very grateful to her for saying that to me. I did get help, and I was really lucky to receive the help that I needed. And it came in many, many forms. So I had some group cognitive behavioural therapy at my university. I had some one-to-one psychotherapy. I went on lots of extended meditation retreats and read way too many self-help books, probably. And eventually, I started to look at why all that fear had come up in me about my ideas and about my writing. And 5 years on, obviously I have good days and bad days, some bad days in the run-up to this, good days and bad days, but 5 years on, I'm much more able to sit with all those unpleasant feelings when they come up, and not just to immediately try and brush them aside. But interestingly, I have had to relearn that ability with my students. So I mentioned that students come to me and often they're seeking really practical solutions and advice. And sometimes there is a piece of advice that I can give them. Sometimes there's a simple exercise. Sometimes there's an intervention I need to make, talking to a parent, talking to a teacher. Sometimes we can put together a study plan. But what I've realized is that often what the student needs and what I need to be able to give them is actually just a space to be unhappy. And what I need to do is really resist that pull to fix and to give them the solutions that they're looking for. And what I find is that when I can do that, something completely different emerges, actually. And what emerges is this sense of equanimity, sense of balance, this sense of self-compassion. The person in front of me is no longer telling themselves that they're really bad for feeling the way that they do. And so when I can operate from this stance of what therapists call creative indifference. So creative indifference is when you can meet the client, in my case a student, you can meet that person's depth of feeling, the depth of despair sometimes, and you can meet it without asking for anything in return. So when you're not asking that the person feels better by the time they leave your office, when you're not asking that their mood changes. And I find that when I can do that, actually the student leaves my office and either they found a solution within themselves, had nothing to do with anything I could offer, or what happens is that the solution becomes less important because the problem itself feels less important. sometimes because the problem wasn't the problem, it was the fact that you felt so ashamed. So this is what I've noticed in my sessions with students, and this is why I think one of the things I think might be contributing to the fact that we're not getting any happier, this inability to tolerate unhappiness. Another thing I think we need to look at is this very definition of happiness that we have. So, what does happiness look like to you? To me, at various points, happiness has been, sometimes it's a perfect relationship. It's a relationship where I never argue with my partner, not even constructively. Sometimes it's been traveling to every country. For a while, it was getting a first in my undergraduate degree, and then a few years later, it was getting a distinction in my master's. There was a particularly nasty time when happiness was really tied up with how I looked and what I wore. And if you can hear yourself in any of these things, then what I want to suggest is that your definition of happiness is the thing that is moving you further away from being happy. It's the thing that's stopping you being happy. Because when we're always focused on what we can get from the world, not what we're bringing, it's just unsatisfying, because there's more and more that we start to need. So, for me, first of all, it was a first in my master's, in my undergrad, and then a distinction in my master's, and then it became a doctorate, and now I'm midway through a second doctorate, and it's just never enough. And the same with education. For so long, I was really focused on what I was going to get from my education. It had nothing to do with what I was putting in, what I was learning, what I was producing. It was just all about that certificate that I was going to get at the end. And it was all about that idea, subconscious idea, that having that certificate was somehow going to legitimize me in front of my parents. So having that certificate was going to make me worthy of their praise and their love. Even though at the time I think they were actually really confused why I was on this path of pursuing this very niche PhD that wasn't utilizing my social skills, and it was very confusing to them, and I think to me as well. So, when we're so focused on what we get rather than what we put in, happiness is just never satisfying. It never ends. And so what we need to do, I think, when we want to think about getting happier is we need to look at that notion of tolerating unhappiness, and we need to go back to the ancient Greeks and their concept of eudaimonia. So eudaimonia for the ancient Greeks was the purpose of life, nothing to do with happiness. And eudaimonia it's a bit like human flourishing. It's the sense of meaning, sense of purpose, sense of fulfillment that you get when you're not focused on what you receive, but when you're focused on what you can give. And the ancient Greeks, according to them, once you could focus on this, when this is your goal, not some extraordinary happiness that just you get it and you never move away from it. When you can focus on this, on being fulfilled, that's when you started to lead a happier life. And this idea is, it's much easier to speak of being fulfilled whilst being a bit stressed, a bit under pressure, but it's very hard to say, yeah, I'm happy, but I'm not happy. Oh, so you're not happy then? Oh, but no, I am happy, but I've just got moments of unhappiness. Linguistically, that's really difficult. But this concept of eudaimonia, if we can focus on it, makes things much more simple. So if I was listening to this, I would be thinking, okay, great, I need to try and bear all my unhappiness, okay, all right? I need to try and move towards this concept of eudaimonia, right, okay? But how do I do any of that? And I think that the answer it starts and it continues with awareness. So hopefully listening to me today, it's planted a few seeds of awareness. But most likely, anything that I have said in the last 15 minutes is going to fade by the end of the next talk, or at least by tomorrow morning. So what we need to do is we need to continue planting those seeds of awareness. And we do that by starting to pay attention to all of the signs that maybe we are ignoring, trying to mask our unhappiness. So for me, some of the signs are, I have this, when my deeper creative need isn't being met, I have this sort of pervasive feeling of emptiness. And it's just like a film that goes across every day. But I can quite easily cover that up. I can clean my house like a maniac. I can get onto Skyscanner and I can open like 20 tabs looking at different flights. And all of these things, that's a real sign to me. When my house is too clean and when I've got 20 tabs of Skyscanner looking at holidays which I don't have time to take, I don't have the money to take, that's a sign to me that maybe I am trying to cover something up. Maybe I'm trying to cover up a deeper unhappiness. So when you start to recognize your own signs, whatever they might be, you can ask yourself a few questions. So 4 questions. You can ask yourself, firstly, what is it that I am trying to escape that perhaps I could sit with for a bit longer instead? Is it fear? Is it shame? Is it sadness? And then secondly, is there anybody who I trust enough to share this unhappiness with? And then thirdly, what is it that my heart is really longing for that it doesn't currently have? Not my bank balance, not my CV. What is my heart really longing for that it doesn't currently have? And then lastly, what is it that I would like to offer the world? And I find that I have to continually ask myself again and again these questions. But when I do, what it does is it puts me back onto this path of ordinary happiness. Ordinary happiness which includes moments of unhappiness. And what I find is when I am on that path of ordinary happiness, and when I see my students on that path of ordinary happiness, actually it feels really, really extraordinary. Thank you.